Hi, everybody. We're going to get started. For those who don't know me, my name is Jeremy Cohen. I'm a sociologist and the director of the honors program here at SVA. And thank you so much for everybody who came out tonight. Tonight is the final lecture in our year series, of the Art and Politics lecture series. What a year it has been to talk about politics and art. And the kind of mission of the lecture series is to think about the relationship between the two, where they intersect, where they diverge in light of the profound crises facing humanity in the present moment, ecological crises, rise of authoritarianism and political crises, economic disasters, racism, and so much more that we as human beings have to confront in these very serious times. And we've had a really full set of programming this semester, from Wafa Naim, the Palestinian textile artist, to, oh my gosh, Brian, you're going to have to help me with his name. Your professor, Roberto Brodsky, the filmmaker, and his film, the anniversary of his film about Chile and the rise of authoritarianism there, and so much more. It's been really quite a year, and plans are already afoot for next year. So thanks for coming out tonight, and stay tuned for more about the next school years. Without further ado, however, I'm going to introduce our lecturer for the evening. Really excited. We've been talking about this night for more than a year, so it's really a delight and really a privilege we have for her to be with us. I'm just going to read a tiny bit because she is so very accomplished that I don't want to forget things. But Anon Ling Cheng, our lecturer for the evening, is a professor of English and affiliated faculty in the Program of American Studies, the Program of Gender and Sexuality Studies, and the Committee on Film Studies at Princeton. You were chair of the English department. You have been. Yeah. Okay. Great. She is an interdisciplinary comparative race scholar who focuses on the uneasy intersection between politics and aesthetics. Her scholarship draws widely from literary and visual studies, race and gender studies, film and architectural theory, legal studies, and psychoanalysis. She works primarily with 20th century American literature and visual culture, with special focus on Asian American and African American literatures. Her first book, The Melancholy of Race, Psychoanalysis, Assimilation, and Hidden Grief, I have the library's copy here, examined melancholia and its role in the formation of racial identity in the United States. She also is author of the work Ornamentalism, also have the library copy here. Actually, what first drew my attention to her work was an op-ed she wrote in the New York Times in, I believe, 2021, What This Wave of Anti-Asian Violence Reveals About America. She also has released recently a second edition of her book, Second Skin, Josephine Baker and the Modern Surface. And I mentioned when we first met that it's kind of fascinating to meet her in person because I'm currently reading her really interesting memoir, Ordinary Disasters, which just came out last year, was named by Hyperallergic as one of the 30 best art books of 2024, and is really a fascinating read of the intersections of personhood, race, gender, disease, and the American psyche in the present. So I strongly recommend reading her work, and I'm so delighted to welcome her here to speak to us this evening. Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you, Dr. Cheng.
Thank you, Jeremy, for the very generous introduction. Thank you for being here. I know it's the end of the semester and everybody's a little worn down, so I appreciate your presence here. Just out of curiosity, how many of you know Eileen Gray, the architect? Okay, so that's right. No knowledge required. I will tell you good stories, I hope. So what follows is a story that unfolds in three movements, a series of entangled revelations provoked by the mysteries of a collage by Eileen Gray. In private hands until 2024, the year that MoMA here in New York bought it, the collage is one of several made by early 20th century architect and designer Eileen Gray. Delving into this history will take us on a twisted journey through the racial and gender dreams of the still recent architectural past. Both on its surface and beyond its boundaries, Gray's collage tells a story about fame and anonymity, professional productivity and envy, and the fantasized projection of others are the heart of modernist innovations. In writing about vision, femininity, and authority, Jacqueline Rose points out that institutional power invariably entails some kind of institutional fantasies, and that those are in turn often linked to the most fundamental images of sexual difference. With Gray's collage, it seems clear, certainly at first glance, that the question of women and their relationship to institutional power, invoked by the reference to the Bauhaus in the lower left quadrant, takes center stage. But what exactly is our relationship, and how does the question of racial difference, foregrounded by the three female figures on the top of the collage, fit in? What work did this early 20th century citation of multiculturalism do? What does it mean for Gray, a white woman from an affluent aristocratic family in Ireland who also faced many institutional challenges in a male-dominated profession, to deploy images of sexual and racial difference to address her thoughts about institutional power, artistic craft, and individual agency? To answer these questions and to fully appreciate the crisscrossing lines of projection identification that is at play both within and without the frame of this collage, please allow me to take you on two detours, one psychoanalytic, one architectural, that will then converge in unexpected ways at the site of Gray's composed field of vision. So section 1, the first projection. Although psychoanalysis has given us some of the most critically productive language for understanding racial dynamics, terms like projection, introjection, identification, disavowal, and so forth, as a field, though, historically speaking, it has been less than perfectly cognizant of its own racial entanglement, even when it's staring at those entanglements right in the face. In Melanie Klein's formative essay called Infantile Anxiety Situations Reflected in a Work of Art and in the Creative Impulse, in which is a very foundational essay, in which she explores the relationship between art and psychical labor. Race and racial difference in this essay make a glaring and yet obfuscated appearance. That is to say, in this essay about creativity, images and ideas of racial difference keep erupting without actually being noted as such. Contemplating how works of art can express the drama and the trauma of infantile anxiety, Klein begins by telling us the story of an artist called Ruth Carr, a beautiful socialite who enjoys wealth, social prestige, and a happy marriage, yet who nonetheless fell into a state of inexplicable melancholia. As Carr's depression deepens, she becomes fixated on an empty space on the wall in her home, a space that seemed to, quote, according to Klein, seemed to coincide with the very empty space within her, end quote. Carr, Klein tells us, is haunted and tortured by this vacuum on the wall. Quote, the empty space screamed hideously down at her, end quote. The blank wall reflects or is a projection of the void within the woman. Now, walls have generally not been that kind to women in literary history. In Charlotte Perkins Gilman's proto-feminist novella, The Yellow Wallpaper, the wall in question occasions not only imprisonment, but also torment. In the story, the female protagonist, like Carr, an upper-class, middle-class white woman enjoying a happy marriage and all the protections of wealth, also suffers from melancholia after giving birth, what we might today diagnose as postpartum depression, and is subsequently, in the plot, consigned by her physician husband to a country house and isolated from everyone, including her newborn child, for a period of enforced rest. In the plot, the protagonist grows increasingly fearful of and obsessed by what she thought were hideous, creeping, maddening figures hidden within the wallpaper. Until one day, she herself disappears into the wall in an act of identification, self-erasure, and/or liberation. It's not clear in the story. So just like Klein's patient Carr, similarly, Klein's patient Carr also comes to a violent confrontation with the tormenting and, in her case, blank wall, when one day she suddenly approaches the offending surface with a black crayon and drew furiously all over it, thereby erasing or filling up the void. After this impassioned and presumably unpremeditated act of sort of messy outpour, Klein tells us Carr then began to take painting seriously. It was only after that first painting or that first drawing on the wall that she started using proper paint and goes on to become a celebrated artist. Many of those, and then Klein will go on to pay attention and do close reading of several paintings that follows that first attempt on the wall. Many of those subsequent paintings were portraits of the women in Carr's family, and Klein will read these artworks as a working through of the artist's unresolved issues concerning her sexuality and her fraught relationship with her mother. And so here are some of the images. These are the paintings done after the first painting. As Klein puts it, quote, "The blank space has been filled. It is obvious that the desire to make reparation, to make good the injury psychologically done to the mother, and also to restore herself was at the bottom of compelling the urge to paint these portraits of her relatives," end quote. In other words, artistic creation enables the work of psychic reparation. So that's the parable, right, that Klein gives. But what about that first painting on the wall? The one that launched this whole story of the birth of an artist. Of that deeply generative image, Klein has almost nothing to say, except to know that it was, quote, "the life-size figure of a naked negress," end quote. Klein offers us this extraordinary information and then never returns to it again. Yet, if we were to read aesthetic production as an extension of self-knowledge and artistic creation, as Klein would argue, then surely it is important that the white women here, both the painter working through her mother issues and the analyst working through her theories about the same, are done so by way of the enlarged projection of a Black woman, potentially even a maternal Black woman. Femininity, maternity, childhood, these points of psychic tension and affective stress are of such great interest to Klein and to Gilman, and yet they appear embroiled with the specters of racial difference. It was Barbara Johnson who pointed out that the submerged centrality of racial difference at work in Gilman's yellow wallpaper, that story about, quote, "old, foul, bad yellow things that stain the walls and that everything with yellow smooches," was written at a time when the term yellow peril and ideas about Asian contagion was first becoming common in America. In Gilman, the misogyny, that which maddens and threatens white womanhood, takes on the guise of the yellow peril. Klein's infantile anxiety situation, too, was haunted not only by Blackness, but also by yellowness. In the same essay where she tells us the Carr story, she also gives us another case study, this time her reading of the opera L'Enfant et le Sortilège by Ravel. The opera tells the story of a boy who, having been scolded by his mother and left alone in a room, in kind of a time out, vents his anger on the room's content, tearing the wallpaper, again, those wallpaper, which here Klein informs us the shredded wallpaper represent the maternal body. She tears off the wallpaper, shattering the china tea set on the table, pouring ink over the tablecloth, and thrashing the furniture. The libretto then takes a surreal turn when the object that the boy has ravaged comes to life and attacks him in return. Reading this story as a parable for projective anxiety, Klein describes the way the object turns on the child with their own hostility. This is how she describes it. Quote, "The clock has a dreadful stomach and begins to strike the hours like mad. The teapots lean over the cup and they begin to talk Chinese," end quote. Here, the ominous threat of disorder, themselves sending in for the absent mother's anger, manifests himself as inanimate objects coming to vengeful life. And it is not a coincidence that these punishing objects, the ceramic, the tea, the textile, are also colonially coveted and racially inflected objects. Little China equal big China. The white maternal threats get displaced onto the object that take Chinese forms, the perpetual threatening other in the Western racial imaginary. So in Klein's case studies and in Gilman's short story, or short novella, racial and gender differences become the liminal boundaries against which white, bourgeois, and modern sanity sanitizes itself. So let's leave that story for now. Let's go to the second projection. Here is another story of retaliatory painting on the wall, this time by a grown man. The mural, alternately labeled Sous les Ponty, Graphie à la Matin, or simply Three Women, was painted along with others by the master architect Le Corbusier in what he vaguely identified as a house at Cap Martin. This house, the house in question, however, is far from anonymous. It is a by now rather infamous E1027 designed by Eileen Gray. Many in the field of architecture will know at least something of the long, notorious history behind this house that was originally designed as a cherished retreat. For our purposes, I will just briefly summarize the part of the history relating to our two architects in question here, Gray and Le Corbusier. So in 1926, Gray, an insistently private person, shortly before her death, she burned all her papers and photographs. So in 1926, she bought a piece of land in Cap Martin that overlooked the Côte d'Azur, not only for its spectacular beauty overlooking the ocean, but because it was, as her biographer notes, inaccessible and not overlooked from anywhere. She really liked the privacy. There she designed and built a house for herself and her lover at the time, Joan Badevici. Never officially trained as an architect, the self-taught Gray created this exhilarating meditation on modernism. With this house, her first major build, Gray played with light and wind, free design and movement. Approximately 14 square feet in size, the interior is in fact not huge, but it feels immensely open and spacious. Gray designed every detail of the house, both exterior and interior, including all the fittings and furniture. For 3 years, she worked alongside local craftsmen and masons, lugging tons of stone and timber up rocky path to the foundation. So she really built this house. E1027 featured many of her signature style, floor-to-ceiling foldable windows, sunken solarium, creative uses of tight corners, furnishing, bed, chair, tables, cupboards, that have multiple functions that would maximize space while minimizing lines, a focus on flexibility and efficiency, the application of industrial material to fluid, sensuous ends. This was not only her home, but also her calling card, her professional entry as an architect. Le Corbusier, an acquaintance of Gray, thought highly of the house. He praised the building in a personal letter to her and tried several times over the decades to buy it without success. This did not stop him from leaving his mark on the house, though. In 1938 to 39, after Gray's relationship with Badevici had ended, she generously left the house to his care. During this time, Le Corbusier, who was friends with Badevici, would often stay at E1027 as his guest. And it was during one of these stays that Le Corbusier decided to, in his words, quote, dirty the walls by painting a series of murals on the blank walls of E1027. Some believe Corbusier must have received permission from Badevici to do so, but we know from their correspondence that he did not. In a letter to Le Corbusier, in fact, Badevici had gingerly pointed out that the architect had put him in a very awkward position with Gray and asked Le Corbusier to apologize. The latter responds that Gray should be grateful for this pictorial intervention from a master and threatened to, quote, spread this debate in front of the whole world, end quote. Gray's response was unequivocal. She called this unsolicited wall drawing an act of vandalism. Now, to this day, this controversy over whether Le Corbusier's action at E1027 were innocuous or offensive remains. During the writing of this essay, a male colleague reminded me that Le Corbusier did not need permission from Gray because she no longer lived there. To which I have only to say, of all people, Le Corbusier knows better what it means to paint on another architect's white walls. And if the walls were, as Klein and Gilman seem to suggest, a screen onto which threat and crisis of motherhood is often projected, then we might consider Le Corbusier's clearly vexed relationship to Gray as the mother of E1027. Is it a coincidence that Le Corbusier painted what he painted on the wall turned out to be something of a family romance? The mural, Three Women, let me just go back. Oh, here we go. The mural, Three Women, depicts two large figures with what looks like a smaller figure in between. According to Marie Shelberg, a friend of Le Corbusier's, the architect had explained to her and friends that the naked figure on the left was supposed to be Gray, while the figure on the right was supposed to be Bardavici. Shelberg writes, quote, and the outline of the head and the hairpiece of the sitting figure in the middle, Le Corbusier claimed, was the desired child, which was never born, end quote. Critics have observed that this wall painting was Le Corbusier's effort to erase or parody Gray and Baldavici's sexuality. She was openly gay, her relationship with Bardavici notwithstanding, to call their intimacy abortive, and to mock her claim as the sole creator of the house. And historically, there has been a lot of debate and confusion over the extent of the Gray's role in designing E1027. People have attributed the design really to Bardavici, some even to Le Corbusier himself, and it's mostly because they could not quite believe that a woman could have conceived of this impressive project alone. But while Gray had read much of Le Corbusier's writing, she never studied with or under him. The ugliness of Le Corbusier imputing infertility to Gray as a woman and as an artist at a time when his own reputation was so much more established suggests that there must have been something about this remarkable creation by a female self-taught architect that plagued Le Corbusier. He was haunted by this house just as he has tried to haunt it with his own signature. In the decades that followed, even after Gray has long moved to another house, Le Corbusier continued to be obsessed with E1027. In 1951, having again failed to buy it, he bought a piece of land right above it and built his own tall cabinet, essentially a watchtower overlooking E1027. And as scholars have noticed, his drawings of his cabanon at Cap Martin always prominently feature. When he draws his cabinet, there's always persons at the window with a binocular. So, in 1956, after the death of Bardavici, Le Corbusier persuaded Shelberg, the same friend mentioned above, to buy E1027, and then he participated in many of the decisions regarding the property, such as refusing Gray's request to retrieve the furniture she had herself designed, a seemingly petty gesture of possessiveness and mastery. Lest we are still unsure of the aggression behind Le Corbusier's inscription on the walls of E1027, not to mention the hot mess of projection, denial, and identification, we should consider the fact that Le Corbusier took and published a photograph of himself stark naked while painting on E1027. In this photo, he had positioned his naked body squarely in front of and thus in the middle of the family wall. This is actually not that one, there's another one. I could not get it, by the way, I just want to point out that the Le Corbusier Foundation will not give me permission to reprint this image, even though you can find it online, and even though Le Corbusier published it himself. But anyway, but I understand why they wouldn't actually. But anyway, in this photo, in a photo, he positioned himself right in the three women. Here then is the disturbing portrait of a master male architect defacing and erasing the work of a talented female colleague for whom he felt envy, desire, admiration, resentment. Architectural historian Beatrice Colomina puts it very starkly, quote, the defacement of the house went hand in hand with the effacement of Gray as architect, end quote. Indeed, giving Le Corbusier's insertion of himself into the picture, so to speak, in his birthday suit, we might wonder whether Le Corbusier imagined himself the desired child who was never born, or the enfant terrible in this fantasy. Freud has famously spoke of female envy, which is to say penis envy. Is this an instance of an answer to the question, what does male envy look like? The story gets even messier, if you can imagine it. Colomier has argued that Le Corbusier's E1027 murals are also shadowed by the ghost of racial difference, because these murals were directly connected to his lifelong preoccupation with Algerian women. This connection is at the level of both subject and technique, demonstrating that hundreds of drawings he made of Algerian women serve as a foundational imagistic schema for much of his larger figure composition, including the ones at E1027. Colomier also points out that Le Corbusier's particular method of drawing, which is the tracing of a wall projection, echoes the way he traces photographs of Spanish and Algerian women, and how he continued to trace and redraw such images throughout his career. Indeed, as a side note, this is just something fun. In April 28th of 1939, the letter that he wrote to Gray admiring the house, he actually wrote it on the letterhead of the Hotel Algiers, as if his psychic association between E1027, what he represents, and his ideas about enviable but inaccessible femininity and otherness were sort of like emerging right in this letter. In his surveillance and invasion of Gray's house, we see a link to his obsessive mentality about mastering that which he desires but cannot own, his way of occupying and re-territorializing the space, the city, and the sexualities of the other by reworking the image over and over again. And so, in this very modern White House, ornamented and defaced by the master of rippling himself, we once again find the ghostly demarcation of femininity and blackness haunting the machine of the modern ego. Okay, let's get away from this image. Okay. Part 3, finally, back to Gray. We're now ready to return Gray's recently surfaced collage. Given what we have uncovered so far, it is not surprising to see a feminist bent to her work. She was clearly used to the challenges of being a lone woman in a very male profession. When she opened her own furniture store in Paris in 1922, she named the store not after herself, but Jean Desser, mostly a male name, most likely suspecting that customer would be more likely to buy objects made by a male designer. She must have negotiated anonymity, projection, and envy her entire professional life. Here on the wall of this collage, we see projected not female nudes, but 3 groundbreaking women of different ethnicity in the diverse fields of entertainment, sports, and aviation, clothed in their respective professional garb. Moving from left to right, we have Esther Lin, the first Chinese woman aviator. She was born in China, but trained and worked in the US in the 1930s, wearing her goggles and flight suit. Little is known about Lin, even though she's this amazing, groundbreaking figure, field-breaking figure. There's almost no record of her, except this picture, right? And the bears of information, her profession. But if you think about it, what it means to be a female Chinese female aviator, at the time when there's terrible anti-Asian discrimination going on, it's kind of amazing. So next to her, we have what is most likely the tennis player Helen Willis, a tremendous athlete with 31 Grand Slam titles to her name. She was the first American female athlete to enjoy global celebrity. And then finally, on the right, we have an image of the iconic Josephine Baker, the performer, dancer, and celebrated race beauty of the early 20th century. Citing these exceptional professional women in her collage clearly makes a feminist statement. But it is precisely the complex negotiation between fame and anonymity that these 3 women, and Gray herself, invoke. Lin, Willis, Baker, all famous, and yet also not. That is, for all their accomplishment, they were either erased by history or survived by having been reduced to certain kind of stock figures. Like all notable persons of color, and true for women in particular, especially in the early 20th century, celebrity is a double-edged sword. It lends recognition and rarefication at the same time. Baker is a perfect example of this ambivalence. Her celebrity in Europe was legendary, even as Americans at the time still knew very little about her. Artists from Matisse to Calder, Leger to Picasso were infatuated with her and devoted works of art to her or about her. But this adulation was itself laden with racist and sexist projection. And in America, in her native country, being a triumphant Parisian star didn't really do much to shield her from the cuts of prejudice. So we have to ask, especially in relation to these collage citations of famous multicultural women, do these women, called forth by Gray, represent Gray's projection or an identification, and what would it mean to think so? And just as a side note, when Josephine Baker, at the height of her career, celebrating in Germany and in France, came back to America, she only came back twice. And the first time she came, a restaurant wouldn't let her in. And then the second at Brown Derby in LA wouldn't let her in. The second time she was let in, but they wouldn't serve her while she was sitting there. So this is where we need to bring back Melanie Klein, our first story, and the mystery of her projection. For years, it was unclear who Ruth Carr was, the woman in the story. It wasn't until 2004 that it came to light that Carr was in fact the Danish painter Ruth Weber. Okay, so Carr was her maiden name. She actually painted under Ruth Weber. With this discovery, that's when we were able to find the images that I showed you earlier of her family. Right? Moreover, we're also finally able to get to see that first drawing, the one of the anonymous originary Black woman. And the drawing of the Black, quote, Black Negress turned out to be not so anonymous after all. It was, in fact, a drawing of Josephine Baker. Suddenly, the figure of Baker, this Black woman navigating the tense difference between celebrity and its specificity and anonymity, any naked negress, reveals herself to be the specter behind all three of our primary objects of interest: Klein's analysis, Le Corbusier's obsession with 1027, and his phantasmatic association with femininity include, as I will talk about in a minute, his actual relationship with Baker, and family, of course, in Gray's collage. What Klein has described as furious scribbles on the wall turned out to be something quite different in composition and affect. The photographic evidence of the original drawing that we have today refutes Klein's attribution of it as a savage, almost unconscious accident. This image does not look like an angry graffito, that does not look like a graffito angrily and spontaneously scrawled by a maddened amateur. Rather, it reads like a composed and sustained meditation, including a meditation on the nature of the nude and the fraud history of the odalisque. The amateur woman is not so amateurish. What Weber gives us is not a quick or even a careless drawing, as we might have expected from Klein's description, but a full body representation of a widely known Black performer, herself very much negotiating the recognition and verification granted by being an icon and a global commodity. And here she is looking rather wistfully, or at least uneasily, at the inanimate vase next to her that is meant to echo her. The relationship between woman and vase, taken for granted for so many years in the history of art, is here raised as a question rather than a given. Moreover, the destructive negativity that Klein has attributed to this first drawing may itself have been a projection of Klein's own a symptom of Klein's own projection, one that had conflated Blackness, Black crayon, Black women, with violence, primitive style, and primitive emotions. Coming back to Gray's collage, we have to continue to question what the figure of the Black woman does for modernist, white, feminist field of vision, and the ethics of looking and image making. Gray's choice of Baker is of note, not only because the latter is actually the most recognizable figure in the collage, aside from the Bauhaus building, but also because of Baker's particular relationship to modernism and modern architectural history. Adolphe Loos very famously designed a house for her, unsolicited. Le Corbusier created a ballet for her, had an affair with her, and even once cross-dressed in blackface as her at a dinner party, speaking of projection and identification. In Gray's, imagine your date showing up cross-dressed in blackface as you. So in Gray's evocation, Baker is neither a haunting nor a veiled reference, but a presence. She is shown dressed in a gold evening gown instead of harking to her much more well-rehearsed primitive iconography. It seemed to me the choice is not simply to offer a more sophisticated or respectable image, but also to underscore the question of women and value, just as Gray wanted to highlight Lin and Will's professional values. The gold cloth that is worn by Baker in his image, in fact, holds very deep resonances for those familiar with her iconography. As I have argued elsewhere, Baker, and this is a very short summary, Baker often deploys the gold cloth as a conceit, as a trope in her performances, especially in moments when she's disrupting European middle-class value and ideas, right? The very ideals that made her famous, even as they negated her personhood. So in a lot of her films and photograph, the gold cloth is evoked as supposedly, seemingly as a reference to civilizational value, but it's actually often the moment when those values get exposed as empty or rapacious or, or something, or sort of colonial roots, right? She plays with the yellowness of gold, alternately calling forth the double meaning as something precious and as something of waste. We might here think again of the Yellow Peril. Both in her extensive photo archive and even more so in her cinematic work, the appearance of gold cloth always coincides with the moment in which European self-celebration becomes deeply exposed as indebted to ideas of waste and disposable labor. So, for example, in the film Princess Tamtam, there's a very famous scene at the end that everyone calls the striptease scene, where she strips. And it's also a moment when her character gets outed as a savage that she really was after having pretending to be a princess. But this scene of corporeal and symbolic disclosure is anything but. For in fact, in the movie, Baker's character strips off her refined gold gown, gold gown, only to reveal, in front of a room full of white people, only to reveal not her naked skin, as one would expect, and as all reviews of the movie seem to misremember, but in fact, she's wearing another full-length black dress underneath. So under the skin tight, there's another black dress. Oops, sorry. So what kind of racial logic allows us to see nudity where there is none? Or thinking back to Klein, allows us to see savage violence where there is none? In Baker's performance, gold fabric, a middle-class accoutrement, and so-called primitive black skin become portable surfaces. What rests on the skin, both ornamental cloth and racial epidermal schema, reveal itself to be a once strippable and interchangeable, mediated, layered, capable of being borrowed or shed like a second skin. What the scene exposes is in fact not Baker at all, but European racial fantasy. So the cloth was a superfluous ornament that Baker transformed into an analytical tool for critiquing civilizational values. Now, Gray was unlikely to have thought this extensively about Baker's performative conceit and her methods. But for those of us interested in Baker's strategy for negotiating the racial codes that bound her, Gray's invocation of Baker in his signature Go reminds us that the latter was a particularly canny performer who attempted to forge a register of agency in the narrow channel between the Scylla of cinematic demands on the one hand and the Charybdis of imperial desire on the other. Gray herself was no stranger to this kind of negotiation between fame and anonymity. She is arguably the single most important female architect of the early 20th century, yet her contribution up until recently have often been elided by architecture history. My daughter, who's an architectural major at Princeton, tells me that in her introduction to architectural history, there was not a single woman mentioned. And when she mentions this to her teacher, he brought in Eileen Gray, finally, but she's very singular. Did Gray see in Baker not the savage dancer with the banana skirt, but the woman navigating what it means to be known? Indeed, this collage addresses the gender politics of fame and modernist architecture in other ways as well. The collage places Gray's own very famous Bebenden armchair, that's a very famous chair that she made, next to the Bauhaus building and facing it. The chair faces the building, showing a creation in dialogue with the school, but also separate from it. Gray, in fact, was already experimenting with the steel tubular construction in France well before the German Bauhaus made that a modernist trope. Then, in a gesture at once whimsical and sarcastic, she sees two women atop the building looking down, irreverently dangling their feet over the building. I like to think, like in goofy jest, that this is Gray's unintended, anticipatory response to Le Corbusier looking over her house. The square of gold foil, which is right here. It's hard to see. It's very shiny in real life. You can see in the slide. The squares of gold foil behind the women picks up the motif of Baker's dress, extending this conversation about value, textile, and craftsmanship. We are reminded that at the Bauhaus, women were often shunted to the school's weaving workshop, which was considered women's work. For the most part, women were not allowed to participate in more prestigious manly tasks like metalwork or architecture, even though the weaving workshop was the most commercially successful department of the school. Could the tangled, unraveling thread in the lower right quadrant be alerting us to the fraught but intimate relations among craft, art, skill, labor, and women's work? Speaking to forms of inequality, subordination, and erasure, Gray's collage offers us a feminist intervention, not by virtue of its themes, like women, famous women, but also by the particular method of citation of the collage itself. Placing Gray's collage in triangulation with our two other instances of wall drawings, that is, Klein's projection of Weber's projection and Le Corbusier's projection of himself onto the love triangle between Gray and Bottavici, help us to see the ethical challenges behind the nature of citation as projection. If the image in the context of a racial and sexual imaginary runs the risk of colonization or appropriation, is there a way to call forth the other that is not appropriative or violent? Though the history of the collage has been one of trauma and violence in its very form, that is especially true of Dada collages, as Bridget Dougherty has argued, Gray's work seemed to instead emphasize the reparative or restorative. By restoration, I don't mean to impute some psychic happy ending to this work, nor do I seek to claim for it some grand liberal agenda. The processes of racialization and gender often speak through each other, but their politics can meet up in uncomfortable ways. Gray's feminism and her racial politics are not necessarily in line with each other. Gray herself was a product of early 20th century modernism with its primitivist and orientalist preoccupation. She too collected African art, and in some of her other collages, these primitive pieces make some, I think, vexing appearances. At the same time, her interests were never simply touristic. She traveled to North Africa to learn about weaving and wool dyeing, techniques she worked with for decades in her own carpet-making craft. Similarly, while her interest in Japanese lacquer seemed to echo the craze for Japonism in France at the time, she actually studied with and for years worked with Seizo Suogawa, a very famous Japanese native expert in lacquer work. Their collaboration was both artistic and commercial. They opened a joint shop on Rue Bonaparte, and extremely productive for Gray, who experimented with color in lacquer work and applied it very innovatively to furniture design. So while I have no wish to claim Gray's collage as achieving some kind of psychical reparation by way of a Kleinian ideal, that dream has its own pitfalls, as we have seen, I do mean to gesture to the ways in which Gray's collage here wants to express the desire to speak against the archive, to address what is missing or erased. While we should always be aware of the harms of appropriation and the violence of cultural protection, we must also attend to those instances in which projection and identification can open up different kinds of windows and do different kinds of work. If Klein had too eagerly attributed psychic resolution in the case of Ruth Weber, then we might consider how Gray's collage imagines a possibility of a community of women, each in her own visual space, unrelated to, but standing alongside one another. Here, the community of women on the board of her collage feels different from the other women on the walls that we have been discussing. She's inviting us to consider the collage as potentially a refusal of or a chosen alternative to other forms and acts of image making, such as drawing. For someone like Le Corbusier, drawing was crucial to his process of possessing the exterior world. As he himself has said, quote, "By working with our hands, by drawing, we enter the house of a stranger," end quote. And we all know by now what kind of a guest Le Corbusier could be. Can we say that in Gray's collage, we are looking at a different way of encountering the other, one accomplished not by way of intrusion or occupation, but by way of an invitation to be present, to be next to. Instead of seeing the collage as a form of appropriative collecting or traumatic disruption, might we see her use of decoupage, her cutting and pasting, in contrast to drawing, not as an act of inscription or appropriation, but instead as a gesture towards a more modest and more ethical feminist mode of citation. Thank you. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer questions or have conversation about this.
You used the term projection in relation to like psychoanalysis a few times. Could you elaborate a bit more about like what that's about, especially like on this topic?
Yeah, so projection is one of the ways in which a person projects an image of the other or the self onto someone else. It's very cinematic, actually, a metaphor. But it means when, so it's often unconscious, and it's also it's one of the processes underlying identification. So when we identify with someone, we actually project an image onto that person, which we then take inside, which he actually calls it kind of cannibalism, like you incorporate the image of the other within. And this process, can be, obviously it can be intentional, like someone you admire and you want to be like them. But mostly Freud is talking about an unconscious. So, the moment when one day you decide, oh my God, I sound just like my mother, that's a moment in which a projection has been taken inside, right? And so it's a useful concept. I mean, for him, it's a psychical process, but it's a useful concept to think about racial dynamics, because that's pretty much what happens, right, in the racial imaginary, is that you project onto the other various kinds of images and expectation. You don't really see the other per se, right? And so, I think the story, the example of the Josephine Baker strip scene, where she actually never stripped, is a perfect example of projection, where they actually projected nakedness onto cloth, right? And it says a lot about the power of that racial imaginary. And it's also a really interesting moment, because we often think about racial identification as a visual thing, racial difference as visual. Right? But what I have often been interested in over the years is the ways in which racial identification and projection works, actually not through the visible, but through other mediums. And the Bakers, that moment is a perfect example of how the visible, in fact, didn't come into play at all. And it says something about what kind and how powerful racial imaginary must be, that you can see nakedness where there is none. And I think that's it's a racialized thing. I think the opposite around like Asiatic racial projection, because I think that's all about cloth and fabric and ornaments, not about nakedness. It's a different racial imaginary, because it says something also about the different modes of racialization that happens. Yes?
Thank you so much for such an interesting talk. I was curious to hear more about the audience for these collages, if any. I just wonder whether she would have made these with the intention for them to be seen, or like I know you mentioned earlier that she burned.
I'm sorry, the what?
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to ask about the potential audience for these works, if any, like whether she would get to be seen or
These collages?
Yeah, these collages.
Well, so actually, we know, this is why it was kind of a mystery. Now we're trying to figure out how to enter into this work. They were owned by family members and friends. And so they have never been seen in public until 2 years ago. And there's very little documentation about them. The only thing we have are those like T46, that's her handwriting. She had numbered them, and that's pretty much it. So it is unclear what the audience reception I think, starting now, there may be much more and more work about this, but we don't know if she intended for people to see them or not. I would assume so. I mean, she was, she was an artist and a designer, and so her work were meant, and also she burned all the things that she didn't want people to see. So I'm assuming they were meant for the public. Yes.
What are the little loops? At first I thought they were her door handles, but on the four corners, there's almost two eye holes and then a piece of string.
Those are actually marks from the pins and staples that were because these are some of these have like here, I don't know if you can see
So the staples stained or kind of leaked a little.
Yeah.
Under the plastic.
Yeah.
And I also thought that when you showed that first image, the image that was you described as a negress, question term. But I thought you had said that it was an image of a black woman and it was described as such, but had it not said Josephine Baker, I have no way. I mean, it seems like projecting blackness or color onto that figure is pretty dubious. I don't necessarily think.
Well,
of
I
that as-
think her face and her hair.
Really?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Josephine Baker. And especially since she was incredibly famous at that time, like incredibly famous.
Well, since
Yeah, so
She's a little too zofty for Josephine Baker.
she's a little bit too what?
A little too zofty for Josephine Baker.
Well, it's a very different kind of representation, right? And it's such a fascinating, and as an image of Baker, this is really fascinating. This is nothing like, imagine my surprise when I found this. It is nothing like Melanie Klein's description. Yes.
Hello. Yeah, so I would say pretty much with the artist academics, Facia Canal, into art history, anthropology, theology, most of women, feminism and Afro cultures. Okay, so the thing, when you look at this picture, you're all right. I mean, the one that spoke up a bit doesn't look like it's been made at all. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but in the African American Afro diaspora community, right, especially, there's this thing that, Caucasians, I say white people, basic, right, tend to think we all look alike. Tend to think we all look alike. So, and this is kind of like no, that doesn't look like her, the figure doesn't look like her, it could be the image, right? And as like the other, you're talking about the striptease, that was the striptease. Okay, there's also like a fetishism, of the black woman. She's over-sexualized.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what she's doing or how she's dressed. Or, it's like a very over-sexualized kind of thing. Of course, they get over there. Of course, and with her especially, yes, she was very, very there, very out there as well, right? But there's a lot that with her, this would make her. Even the fact she was more popular, her beauty was very much appreciated, supposedly, in Europe, than the US, I'm sure she doesn't have friends here as well, we know that. But it's a very like a fetishism, and she must be naked, right? Even like in that painting that you showed earlier, the way it's not a graceful way to depict her, her legs were open, the way she was, it wasn't quite, wasn't quite, it just not very graceful in the sense that legs were open.
Yeah, I actually do think there's something uneasy about this, which I thought was a very interesting meditation because, in fact, in her iconography, in her presentation, she's never uneasy. Right? Josephine Baker is never uneasy. She's the ultimate performer. Right? So there's a lot in what you just said. I just want to pick up some threads of it. One is there is no denying, and this is what I mean about the double bind of celebrity, right? She's famous, but she's famous as a fetish, right? Like a fetishized object. So that's the double bind of celebrity for women of color especially in the early 20th century. But the second thing I want to say about Baker is, and this is why I wrote a whole book about this, is that, I think that for many people, there's basically two kinds of Baker fans, or two kinds of Baker audience. Those who adore her and those who are embarrassed by her. And the people who have managed to redeem her as a figure in African American history are those who often focus on the latter half of her career, where she helped, during World War II, where she was a spy, right? Where she was, she did this very important work for U.S. liberation, for the civil rights. But this earlier part of her career was often sort of like a little bit like, oh, that's the embarrassing moment when she was like playing up to the primitive, and that's how she got famous. But I actually think that it's super important to think about, so are we actually going to stop thinking about her because she has been objectified? Right? What does it mean to think about agency for someone who has no agency, by which I mean not only as a Black woman, but also a Black woman artist? When you're a performer, you're under the coercion of a lot of different forces, director, script, there's a, but when I watch, I don't know how many people here, but when I watch, this is like a little story, but for years, I couldn't watch Josephine Baker because it pained me to think about, right, all the fetishism around this figure. But then when I finally watched her films, they are incredible. They are incredible and sarcastic and witty and ironic. And these moments when you think she is playing the primitive are often moments when she is doing something very sly. And one of the things that she does in a lot of her film is all these moments when she gets exposed. And if you look at, if you look at her films and count all the moments when she's exposed, both literally and figuratively, it's always a moment when she gets covered over. There's a moment here when she had the black dress underneath. There's another woman where she was, I can't remember the name of the movie now, where she was discovered. She was a stowaway on a boat, and she was discovered in the coal bin, and she was covered in black coal. So her revelation as Blackness is actually black coal, that there's actually this layer of Blackness around her. And then there's another scene where she's uncovered in the flower bin, where she's covered in white flour because she jumped in, And so I think, even though she was clearly, a fetishized object, and she was under the script of, very different kind of, various kind of levels of scripting, she nonetheless was very playful and smart about what her performance can do. So that I feel like there are these moments of interesting subversive agency that emerges, not a kind of like, hey, in your face, but like very clever, performative, stylistic. And that's why I think it's kind of amazing that not a lot of people have actually studied her performative style, because the strategies are incredibly uncanny and incredibly canny and very clever. What was the other thing I was going to say about her fetishes? Okay, the other fetish thing that's interesting is her banana skirt, right, which is very famous. But if you think about the actual metaphor of like the fetish according to Freud and what it means, it's for her to wear the banana. It's really weird because the bananas are really like, so she's like the lack, right, that whiteness project onto, but she's the one wearing all the phalluses, right, these bananas. And in the course of her career, in the course of maybe 10 years, if you follow her performance with the banana skirt, you will notice that the banana went from flaccid little plastic thing to rigid, spiky metal things. So, I'm just saying, there are ways in which I think Baker herself has played with fetishism and unwrapping it, disclosing it, turning it inside out in these, I think, very subtle but powerful ways. So they're never explicit, but there's always an undoing happening underneath. And in all the films that she's famous for, where she, all these sort of colonial imagination, she's, like in Princess Tamtam at the end, instead of returning to a kind of fantasy, you get this sort of, at the end of the show, of the movie, there's a book which represents Western civilization. It's all torn, and the pages are flying in the wind. So anyway, I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but I do think that her performance are really worth looking at as strategies, because I think they do really interesting things, all within the understanding that her agency is terribly constricted, right? Yes.
Just wanted to say that it seems to me one of the unspoken subjects of what you're looking at is Picasso. I mean, the Corbusier drawing is a kind of rip-off of Picasso from one era. The Icare one is from another era. Even the collages are from another era. So, I mean, sort of like looming over that seems to be Picasso and his connection to primitivism, his connection to walls, and his connection to women.
Well, now
It's
it's
just interesting that you left it all out.
well, it's rumored that that's kind of a given, but that's sort of the premise of modernism. But I think that, this is a great story about Picasso and Baker. It's rumored that he did a drawing of her, though we haven't seen it, right? But anyway, at some point, and this is another example of her very canny, at some point, a reporter asked her, so what do you think of Picasso? And she says, Pizarro, I don't know who that is, just bunch of wiggly lines, she said. Now, that is super funny because obviously she know who Picasso was. And so she was making fun, right, of art and art's value and projection. And in fact, the whole thing about just squiggly line is super interesting too, because her work is squiggly lines. Right? And so I think one of the ways to, for me, that I thought was very rewarding was instead of looking at how white modernists have seen Josephine Baker, it's important to see how Josephine Baker has altered the way they see. And in my book on Baker, I sort of trace the ways in which these architects have been interested in Baker and her performance style in ways that are particularly important to the pressure point of their own architecture theory. So Adolf Loos's interest in her skin is actually doing a lot in relation to his idea of claddings, of like buildings. Le Corbusier idea of freedom, the radiant city, all that was formulated on board on the ship when he met Josephine Baker, and she became for him a sort of site not only of Black freedom, which is a typical kind of projection, but also how being with her actually like really troubled his own notion of what freedom means. So when we read their work through her performance strategy rather than her through their work, you actually see a very complicated intellectual engagement that is troubling for these men with Baker. And I actually think that that's why Baker was the kind of figure that she was. I mean, there were a lot of Black women dancing in Paris at that time. White Baker, right? I think there's something about what she represents and troubles about their own modernist ideals, that's what captures, that's what they connect onto, you know? Yeah.
I think, thank you for the talk. When Luz designed the Josephine Baker house, it's really obvious that that house is designed as a sort of device of fetishization, right? Like there's that big pool where Josephine's supposed to swim inside, and there's that sort of fancy point where you can look at it. And similarly, I feel like Le Corbusier, when he designed the Cabanon, it was also a device of fetishization. But I'm not sure if it's fetishizing gray or E1027. Because there's that one single window out of the Cabanon where there's this hinge mirror, right? Which lets Le Corbusier, when he's staying inside, hear at a slither of the house. So do you think that distinction between fetishizing a person or a building is important for Gray when she made that?
Well, okay, two things. One is I think that he was obsessed with the building itself, but why? Right? There were other modernist buildings around. And so I think his fetishizing of that house has everything to do with the fact that it was made by, if not Gray, just a woman. an untutored, self-taught female architect, right? Now, the thing about Ada of Lowe's' house, I think it is right. I mean, it is so clearly this, crazy fantasies about intending to spectacularize Baker. But if we were to do what I say, instead of reading her through him, but him through her, is that if you think about Josephine Baker herself, nobody spectacularizes herself like Josephine Baker, right? She is like the pre-Madonna, Mia Farrow, pre-Angelina Jolie. She turned her house into a museum with dioramas of herself while she was living in it, right? This is a person who, so what does it mean to spectacularize someone who spectacularizes herself all the time, right? So that's the first thing. And the second thing is her spectacularization of herself, her exposure of herself is always, I think, done through various kinds of covers, including, I would argue, the cover of Her Naked Skin. Right? And so one of the things about the Ada of Lowe's house is that if you were to, so it was never built, so it doesn't exist, but there have been digital recreation of this house, and it's in my book, you can see it. But if you actually were to walk in the hallway of the swimming pool, he built this house is dominated by a 2-story swimming pool, so it looked like a fish tank, right? Intended to spectacularize Baker. It's not a wonder she didn't want the house. She didn't want to build. But anyway, but if you were actually to walk around, and I'm, Beatrice Colomina has also observed, if you were to walk around the house, it's actually really hard to look into the pool because of the top reflecting light. So when you look into the pool, the first thing you see is yourself, not the swimmer. So you see and encounter an image of yourself projected onto, and then because there's also windows behind, there's a lot of reflections going on. And so it'd be interesting, it's interesting, I mean, he might have intended it as a way to spectacularize Baker, but in a way, if he was to be the audience, he would be like reflecting himself, right? And it's a kind of exposure of him more than it is an exposure of her. So again, I think that, yes, the house is intended to be, this racist imagination, and it's intended to enclose her. But it actually also exposes the creator's, right, own desires and projections. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, I thought this was a terrific talk. Thank you so much. I think I love the detective story aspect of it and how you took us through the kind of discovery of the pieces along the way. I was wondering, one of the things, unless I missed it in a moment, in the collage, you didn't really talk about the kind of skein on the right bottom. And I was just curious, insofar as kind of making a mess and sort of like making a mark in Corbusier's very aggressive way, and Melanie Klein's reading of it was so much a part of your investigation. I was kind of, I wondered what you thought of the kind of the messiest part, as it were, of the collage.
Yeah, I thought, oh, go ahead. Yes, Susan?
I was just gonna say, the piece above is a tracing of the outside of that tan horn, rotating.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I don't know. What I read it as really a kind of gesture to one, textile weaving, but instead of like orderly weaving, what we get is entanglement. And I thought the entanglement was super important because it is kind of like in direct opposition to the sort of like the cleanness of the Bauhaus. And I think it's a reference to the weaving workshop in the Bauhaus, which is female dominated at the time.
But I think his point is interesting, that it's also the line drawing that Corbusier messed her house up to.
Yeah. It's so funny because when I first saw this, it's let me see if I can. Hang on. So they kind of dated to 1935, and I wanted to date it like a couple of years to like so that you could like actually address the whole Le Corbusier incident. But then I decided not. I couldn't prove it, but also I thought he's taken up too much space in the story already. This is her collage.
I want to ask a question. Am I right in remembering that Le Corbusier did not think to make furniture until after
Yes.
the incident with Eileen Gray?
Yes.
And then he hired another woman to make the furniture.
Well, actually, that's the thing. So, when she built E1027, it's like a year before, or no, I'm sorry, it's just a year after his exhibition at the I'm forgetting the convention, the L'Esprit de something, where he showed his famous house. But anyway, this came 2 years after that. But this actually is the first time that the inside was also done, right? She did all the furniture inside, and that's something he had done exteriors, but not interior. So in a way, she was kind of ahead of him in that way, And the furniture is so cool. I mean, they're like, a corner where you swivel out. They're very what we call ergonomic today, and there's a lot of her furniture and her lacquer work, her screens are at MoMA. So you can see, like the 4th floor or something, you can see them. They're sort of, the furnitures are quite amazing, actually. She was an incredible designer. Thank you, everybody.